Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Digital RESI September Conference, and welcome to the Impact Investors panel, hosted by Life Science Nation and moderated by Leukemia and Lymphoma Society Vice President Laura Grunbaum. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Well, welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here today with you and to moderate the discussion, which we hope you'll find interesting. What we'd like to do is we have a few questions prepared. We'll introduce ourselves and we'll discuss a few questions that we think will be of interest. But please feel free to send in questions via the chat, and Jessica will be collecting questions for us, and we'll leave some time at the end to address your questions explicitly. So without further ado, I'd like to start with a quick round of introductions. As Jessica said, I am here as a representative of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. I'm in charge of their venture philanthropy program, the Therapy Acceleration Program. I'm a trained molecular biologist and biochemist, received industry training at two large pharma companies, Boehringer Ingelheim and Roche Pharma, both in drug discovery and drug development, and then switched to the startup side and was part of the executive team of two small startup companies in the Boston area and most recently in New York. And have joined really LLS with the hope that I'll be able to help with some of the difficulties that, of course, entrepreneurs run into when they try to get their companies off the ground, really having seen this and lived this from both sides, at the large pharma side as well as the startup side. So I'll go around our panel. Paul, if you'd introduce yourself briefly to our audience.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Larkin, Manager of Research Innovation at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. My background before the foundation is in academic neuroimmunology, followed by a couple of years doing commercialization of life science in a number of different settings, consulting, venture capital, and tech transfer. And then I joined the foundation about a year ago to work really on our commercialization efforts, which are a relatively new thing for the foundation. The foundation itself has more than a 50-year history of funding basic research, sort of NIH-style grants, and serving as an education support and advocacy organization for patients, and also as a professional society for practicing physicians in the field. And this move to funding product development and really thinking more about commercialization is a relatively new set of programs for us, but it's certainly an exciting one and a growing one, and we'll certainly get into the details of what we're doing, but the focus is really on our IBD Ventures program, which is our venture philanthropy style funding vehicle, along with some other resources that we're developing related to that.
Excellent, thank you. We'll keep going. Kuldip, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Kuldip Dave, Vice President of Research at the ALS Association, pharmacologist by training, worked in pharma and biotech before switching into the nonprofit world. I was at the Michael J. Fox Foundation for 9 years before joining the ALS Association about 15 months ago. The ALS Association is the largest philanthropic funder of ALS research in the world. We have a sort of a three-pronged mission approach: research, care services, and advocacy. We fund pharma and biotech mostly through non-dilutive grant investments. I'm happy to speak more later about the different ways that companies can interact with an association like ours.
Thank you. Let's keep going around. Michael?
Hi there. So my name is Michael Cole. So I'm managing partner for Global Neural Health Ventures, and then also a faculty member at UC Berkeley. Just real quick in terms of background, so I was trained in clinical neuroscience for research, and then clinical neuropsychology clinically. And I'm still involved with both of those to greater or lesser extent. Started my career in academia, and then saw in terms of with the translational clinical neuroscience could really have greater impact within early stage clinical neuroscience companies, and that's where I spend most of my time now. And specifically within Global Neural Health Ventures, what we're focused on is early stage clinical neuroscience companies in response to what we saw a few years ago in terms of a real paucity of funding going into early stage clinical neuroscience. And so this is in comparison to the amount of money that was going into healthcare in general. And we saw companies doing really incredible work, but having a difficult time getting funding. And there's a lot of reasons in the ecosystem, a lot of the phase 3 trial failures in Alzheimer's disease and otherwise, that really made a lot of investors gun shy in this area. So we decided to jump in with Global Neural Health Ventures. And so venture philanthropy, we really focus on impact too with the companies. And we look at that actually very empirically, and I think one of the areas of discussion later, maybe I can unpack that a little bit more, how we approach that. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. And Chris, if you want to round us off with your intro.
Sure, I'll be quick so we can get to the more meat of this presentation. Chris Penland, I've been with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation for 21 years, and we've invested in probably dozens and dozens of companies over the years, primarily through non-dilutive funding, but we're starting to examine other means of financial support to advance our mission. So I'll stop there. We can
Perfect.
move forward.
Yes, and I want to pick up actually on a few things that have already been brought up, for example, by you, Michael, which is this concept of impact investing. And what I'd like to ask everyone is their thoughts on what impact investing is, maybe in particular in the context of your organization. How do you define that? How does that, how is it aligned with your mission? So what does impact investing mean in the context of your particular organization? So Paul, if we want to start with you again.
Sure. Well, I guess I can start with sort of the basics of it, is that there is a tax code definition for that. And I won't go into all of that, but to me, the critical parameters for a nonprofit foundation like the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation to make an investment, a program-related investment, is that it has to be aligned with the mission of the foundation. So that's obviously first and foremost in everything we do at the foundation, and essentially, what I think nonprofits in general do with their investments. And that's also something that's governed by the tax code, and we definitely have lawyers that look at any of the agreements that we enter into to make sure that they count as program-related investments that are allowable to a nonprofit when we are making investments into commercial entities. I think the other piece of it is that legally we're not supposed to have profit as the primary motivation for those investments. And so that is something that certainly also enters into our calculus as we consider that. But really the biggest one that drives their decision is alignment with mission. And I think that's probably a difference in a foundation or other impact investor versus a standard investor. I'm sure you guys have a little more flavor to add in from your specific organization, so I'll stop there with a brief overview.
Great. Kuldip, you want to add to this from your perspective?
Yeah, again, it goes to the mission of the organization, as Paul mentioned. We at the ALS Association do have financial return in our contracts, but it's mostly repayment. If the drug gets to the market and has commercial sales. And so the idea that we can get a return on what our initial grant investment was, so that we could put that back into research again. And so I know that is also similar to what Michael J. Fox Foundation used to do. It's a little different than some other organizations who could have more than repayment in the contract, and instead even have royalties. And so there's sort of distinctions depending on what organization you're with.
Okay, Michael?
Yeah, so very much so in the same theme, with being very kind of customized manifestations of impact within global neurohealth ventures. So we define it very specifically and use that criteria for investment. So we're all scientists by training, and so I think that translates to us being a little bit nerdy about it. And we have very specifically defined variables that we have conglomerated together in what we're calling neurovector. And so there's different things that feed into it. So we look at, for instance, for a company and what they're working on, the World Health Organization, lifetime disability ratings for ranking, the diseases that they're addressing. And we're all entirely focused on psychiatry or neurological disease states. What's the prevalence of the disease? And then also what's available to treat the disease. So if there's nothing that's available that really gets large traction, a good example is Alzheimer's disease. There's some that kind of address symptoms, but not great even with that. Then they would score much higher. And so we have these conglomerated together. We're also interested in the more traditional aspects of profitability too. And we actually weighed it 50-50, so like impact 50%, and then the more traditional venture profitability lens to 50%.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Chris, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I think that Michael may have spoken to it a bit. When we think about impact investing, we're looking at what's the unmet medical need within our patient community. So we have a very large patient registry, which has been going on for 50-some years. And so we have a good view into the needs of our, I would say, stakeholders. And so, we're not going to fund, one more of the same, me too, if you will, type of product. They need to be differentiated. There needs to be some benefit brought to the patient population, either coverage of an unmet existing need, or perhaps ease of administration, since the total treatment burden on our population on a daily basis is quite high. So how do we satisfy those needs is an important part of what we're seeking to address when we are identifying opportunities.
Great, thank you. I've heard many themes that also resonate in terms of the organization I represent here, the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. I think maybe one thing I want to add, for me, going into being part of a organization with a very long history that's been around since 1949 and has initially focused mostly on sort of traditional grant funding, spent around 1.3 billion at this point in time on research, and more recently has gotten into this area of impact investing, venture philanthropy, with this therapy acceleration program, which was actually started in 2007. And that also has had an interesting history in terms of being initially focused very much on individual asset funding, contingent return asset funding, and then really having moved into an equity-based model based on really what we've perceived as an opportunity to have a stronger impact, both in terms of actually driving, helping companies drive strategy, drive value, clinical advance, but also in terms of eliciting interest from professional investors and companies and building alliances with other investors and really driving money towards blood cancer research. So our mission, of course, is focused on the acceleration, the advancement of novel blood cancer therapies. I think what we have in common with what several of our participants here have emphasized is that we are focusing on novel therapies, not on me-toos. We're really focusing on best in class. We're looking primarily at unmet medical need, at underserved patient populations, we are looking also explicitly at niche indications where we know that often there isn't really a business case for large companies, and where we think we can really help to drive medical advances. So in that sense, we have a little bit more complex funding model where we also fund academic research institutions, in particular with ISTs, as well as biotech companies. And again, we're mission driven, and of course, any ROI in our case goes back towards the mission of LLS. The mission of LLS is bigger than just research. There's a lot in terms of patient support and advocacy. So returns go not just towards research or towards the therapy acceleration program, but go towards the entire mission. So I think it sounds like we're not that far off from each other in terms of how we define impact investing and how we manage sort of the two aspects of it, being mission driven at the same time also taking into account that we want to back financially sound and savvy companies and organizations that actually will be able to really move drugs forward. So let's maybe switch focus a little bit, as we're all in different fields. Funding landscapes, of course, can be quite different. And maybe what we can talk about a little bit is what in your particular areas, what does the funding landscape look like? And in that landscape, being aware of that landscape, what are you specifically looking for in early stage companies? You know, what makes a company attractive for you for funding? And we can mix it up a little bit in terms of order. So maybe I'll start with Chris. Chris, what are your thoughts? What makes a company attractive for you?
Well, again, it goes back to this area of are they satisfying or attempting to satisfy an unmet need for our patient population? So there's that aspect. I think that as CF is a genetic disease, recessive genetic disease, and there have been some really great strides in the last couple of years seeking to address the protein that goes awry in CF, and frankly, astounding clinical benefits have been noticed by a growing percentage of our patient population. But now we have a significant, a small but significant group of individuals who, simply because of their underlying mutations, aren't going to be eligible for these small molecule treatments. And so, you know, another aspect that we're looking at now is how do we find opportunities that are going to be able to bring to these patients a therapy that is going to restore protein function, but is agnostic, if you will, as to the underlying type of mutation that the patients have. So we're looking for binning opportunities, if you will, to or binning technologies that are going to be broadly applicable. And I'd say those are the, you know, as we look at the types of companies that as they come to us, you know, how are they going to be of the most interest? They're either addressing an unmet need or they have a technology that is going to be applicable to individuals for restoring CFTR function regardless of the underlying mutation. So that's really what we're looking for these days.
Great, that sounds like it's very focused to you. So this is, maybe you can talk a little bit more in terms of how do you make companies aware of this specific focus and attract companies and start discussions in terms of finding companies that really are a good match in terms of that specific focus.
Sure. So last year we announced a $500 million 5-year commitment to advancing these mutation agnostic therapeutic approaches. I think 2 years ago we announced a $100 million infection research initiative. So that is to treat the underlying pathogens that seem to infect the CF lung preferentially. And then, how do we get the word out? Well, I think that that is always a difficult proposition. We had the opportunity to sell a royalty stream several years ago, and that event made it into the Wall Street Journal. And so since then, the number of companies that have come to us has greatly expanded. Last year, we met with, I think, at least more than 175, may have been more, with more than 180 companies. So there's not a dearth of groups seeking financial support. It is I think the onus is on us to inform them, really these are the high priority areas that we want to focus upon. So to give industry some guidance beforehand.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's keep on this topic a little bit. Michael, what are your thoughts in terms of what gets, what are you targeting when you look at the funding landscape overall, and how do you identify and attract companies that could be a good match in terms of your mission?
Yeah, sounds good. So in terms of the landscape, it's been rather bleak within the clinical neurosciences. Like I was mentioned before, it's been left somewhat in the shadows with a lot of money coming into the healthcare. And so looking at specifically, actually Silicon Valley Bank and PitchBook were really generous. They provided like the last 30 years worth of data for companies within the clinical neuroscience space. So primarily psychiatry and neurology. And in fact, we have seen this dip over the last 5 years or so. And so that's really kind of the current landscape. And there is some money coming in. It's interesting, but a lot of times there's kind of this herd mentality. And they glom on to, there's companies like Alkahest and Denali who are doing genuinely very, very good work. But there's almost this kind of pseudo de-risking by many other people jumping on board. And so those companies have done very, very well, but then there's been a lot that are doing incredible work that are left in the shadow. So that's been, where things have been at. I should note though that there is some whiff of things starting to change. More folks are getting more interested within this area, and so that's been encouraging to see, from family offices to VCs and otherwise, and actually angels too. So that's actually been very encouraging to see. I don't know how much traction that's getting, but we've started to see some of that. So in terms of us specifically, what we're really focusing in on would be one of the biggest areas is disease modifying therapeutics, particularly in the areas that there are none, that there exists no disease modifying. There might be treatments of symptoms, but no disease modifying therapeutics exist. And primarily in the big dementias, Lewy body disease, Alzheimer's, etc. So that's one area of focus. Another area of focus is that was existing, but now, given the impact portion of it, digital health and the needs with that, and obviously we're seeing this huge transition right now within remote care. And a lot of that looks, at least from our perspective and within our kind of neck of the woods within healthcare, it looks like it's going to stick in many respects. And so that can and has had tremendous impact. And so we're very interested in that space. And then in terms of, I guess, sourcing, it helps. It's a little bit easier in a lot of ways that we have kind of a circumscribed space that we're in. And so it's based on our network and then other database resources like PitchBook and various conferences. And then certainly, folks cold contact a fair bit too. And those are probably some of the primary ways that we get in touch with folks.
Thank you. Thank you. Paul, what does it look like for Crohn's and colitis? Of course, there's a significant patient population here, and also it's been a lot of interest from large pharma. So I'm wondering, what take your organization has on having a mission and the highest impact.
Yeah, sure. And so, as you're saying, there is a fair amount of interest in big pharma, and there is certainly space for deal making there. And that's great. We certainly want to be a connector to that sort of downstream funding source. And we see pharma and biotech as necessary partners for doing a lot of the development work that's ultimately going to get something to market and to patients. But we try to be a little bit earlier stage in general. And some of that is driven by the specifics of our funding model. So we generally fund projects up to $500,000 per project for a project that generally lasts about a year. And so that comes with a couple of constraints. In terms of a late stage asset, we're not interested in being a drop in the bucket funding a giant phase 3 trial or something like that, because there is, as you were mentioning, pharma interest and pharma support for that sort of thing. But at the same time, we realize that the $500,000 that we're providing is not going to be enough to really advance an asset, certainly not to the clinic. And so we want to make sure that the work we're funding really is a critical path activity for the company. And the hope is that it would enable the company to do something that really provides a value inflection point of some kind, or gets you to a decision point of some kind. But we realize that those aren't going to be final decisions in every case. And so we want to make sure that the companies that we invest in are commercially viable and do have the ability to continue the necessary development work even after our funding is used up. And there is certainly an option for a competitive renewal of that funding or additional funding that would follow on, but that is a competitive process, because our process in general for funding is in some ways similar to a grant review cycle, in that we run 2 cycles of applications per year, and we get anywhere from 40 to 120 or so applications in a year, and we can only fund a very limited number of them. And so we run that cycle to include both newcomers to it, and funded companies have the opportunity to reapply. And of course, we do welcome resubmissions, and we try to give feedback along the way. So we try to make that a part of the benefit that we offer to any applicant, is beyond the possibility of funding, both being a part of their networks, so joining that by applying, but also receiving our feedback and our internal and external review committees' feedback on any applications that we receive. And in terms of the sort of scientific landscape for Crohn's and colitis, as you're saying, there are a number of treatments out there, but it's a very, very heterogeneous set of diseases. Patients, many of them respond, many of them don't respond, many of them respond for some time and then lose response over time. And so it's a very sort of dynamic space in terms of the opportunities that are still available, even despite the very well funded and well selling assets that are out there for IBD already. So we, like everyone here, I think, tend to focus on unmet need. And we define that in a number of ways. And one of the ways that we sort of publicize our findings on that is through a series that we publish every 5 years called Challenges in IBD. And so we publish that in our journal. And that's sort of a process where we work with a lot of stakeholders in the IBD community, whether they're physicians or researchers or clinical or academic researchers or patients, of course, and try to understand what they feel the unmet needs are, along with the potential opportunities in the space to meet those needs. So we do try to get that out there as a document that will inform potential applicants about what we're most interested in, but we are really open to anything that may help patients with IBD. And so we're very modality agnostic. If it's drugs, devices, diagnostics, digital health, whatever it is, we would be happy to have that application, as long as it is meeting an unmet need, and as long as the company is one that really has the potential to advance that, if not directly to market themselves, and certainly to a value inflection point. So I think that's sort of an overview of our structure and why that works for us. And really the guiding principle, again, is that unmet need and commercial viability.
Both of these are critical. I think we definitely are hearing that as a theme from everyone. cool dip. I think ALS certainly has gotten quite a bit more public attention over the last years. And I'm interested in hearing whether you also come out with a specific funding focus or how you approach getting companies interested or even directing companies towards particular approaches.
Yeah, we were lucky enough to get the Ice Bucket Challenge funding 5 years ago. Our scope is fairly wide. We fund biology, translational space, drug development, biomarker development, um, very early phase 1, some phase 2 trials, and then we also fund a lot of assistive technology development, telemedicine type research, care, patient burden, things like that. Industry can actually apply for any of those topics. They don't just have to apply for drug development projects. Speaking about our drug development RFA, we, like Paul said, the max we give is $500K for a 2-year project. The goal is to really, we know, even though we're the largest philanthropic funder, we're definitely not the largest funder. NIH is a larger funder than us. They fund 4 times more than we do in terms of ALS. So our goal is really to fund at those inflection points, critical junctures. Michael used the word de-risk, and use our funding to hopefully for industry to leverage those dollars. In fact, our study we did showed that $40 million of our funding resulted in $120 million of follow-on funding. And that's really our success point. That's our sweet spot. In terms of how we pick those projects, drug development projects, again, in our case, there is an unmet need. We don't have a cure or a disease-modifying treatment for ALS. Patients generally live 2 to 5 years. So it's a pretty drastic and terrible disease. And so we're looking at target approach, feasibility, whether the company has expertise in ALS or are they tied up or collaborating with academic experts. Those are some of the criteria for funding. And how we let them know is, through forums like this, grants announcements. I take calls every week with individual biotech and pharma and help them out, whether they're looking for advice on funding or even non-funding advice, like what animal model they should be using, or what who in the academic field can they partner up with. So really, that's how we operate.
Yeah, it's I think for every one of us, there's a variety of venues how companies engage with us. And I think I can add to this that often this is a multi-year process, certainly for LLS, through our extensive grant program and our network of KOLs. We're often aware of emerging companies and sometimes encouraging new COs as they move through our grant portfolio. Which really gives us a nice opportunity to look at not just what is in drug discovery and maybe approaching clinical development now, but really what's the next generation of therapeutics, of platforms that's being developed. So I think for LLS being focused on blood cancers, which are about 10% of all cancers, but definitely in the pharma world, I think there is still, in general, more attention being paid, of course, to solid cancers. And one of our areas of interest is really to drive interest in companies and awareness for opportunities, for assets, and also for platforms, really to have a strong impact on blood cancers and to help them understand the complexity of the disease indications within blood cancer and really assist with an understanding of the right indication and the right patient populations. So that is a big part of what we're trying to do as we engage with companies, as I said, often in a multi-year process. And ultimately, where we like to really step in with TAP funding, with the venture philanthropy funding versus grant funding, is when companies are approaching, I would say, at least within a year of an IND. So we could, I think, Paul, you mentioned that as well, critical activities in terms of enabling start of clinical studies, supporting an IND. And then generally we like to invest quite heavily in first in human or first in blood cancer studies, and really help companies also develop a very sound translational strategy and clinical development plan. We also do invest in registrational studies. We actually have contributed to the approval of 3 therapies in the blood cancer space. One of the CAR-Ts, Yescarta, was initially supported through grants and then also supported through our TAF program. And then I think a good example is one of our therapies, Zonris, which is for a dendritic cell neoplasm, which is a very rare type of blood cancer. So good example for us helping a company find a niche indication that had a high unmet medical need, but probably never would have been on their radar screen without us, and really helping them build a strong scientific rationale and also the business case, and then really supporting them even in terms of the advancement through the clinical development process. So those just as a couple of examples. We're looking into quite heavily focused on novel platforms. We've recently invested in Chimera, which just went IPO, the first one of the first pro-tech focused companies. Again, we're looking at the novel platforms where we see a potential to really have impact and help to position these novel platforms also towards blood cancer, so that blood cancer is not just an afterthought, but there's an awareness and appreciation that sometimes it can be a very good entry indication and an opportunity to learn a lot. As blood cancer, of course, we have the huge benefit that in terms of biomarkers, we have much more accessibility often, especially non-invasive biomarkers than in many other indications. So let's maybe switch gears a little bit. So we've talked about the landscape. We've talked about sort of what you're looking for. We've heard a little bit about the due diligence process from some of you. I'd like to talk a bit more about what can companies expect as they actually get funding from you. How do you engage with them? How do you work with them? And if you haven't commented on the due diligence yet and like to do that, please feel free to add that. I know sometimes there's a sort of a transition of support from due diligence stages into the sort of ongoing support stages. So maybe Michael, if we want to start with you and then move around the group again.
Yeah, sounds good. So our perspective is that we have an accelerator that's yoked to Global Neuro Health Ventures, and what we try to do is provide a lot of support, not only scientifically. So that's the major background with the folks that we have on our team in various areas within clinical neuroscience, but then the business aspect too. So we go in pretty early, and so a lot of times these are MDs, PhDs, or MD PhDs that have incredible knowledge area within their vertical, but understandably less so within the business aspect. And so that's one of the areas that we really try to work with them to make sure that there's sound business decisions, that the runway is not burnt through too quickly, et cetera, et cetera. So we really try and take both those aspects and be as available as possible to help in both those primary respects. And so I guess another thing to note too is part of it is the perspective that we take in the approach or the strategy is to actually save most of the funding for follow-on funding. And I think this was alluded to before too, is to really make sure that they're not left high and dry, and to once a commitment is made to a company, to make sure that they can make it through to the point that they're de-risked enough that the other investors then become more interested. So for us to be, roughly phase 1, phase 2, then they're oftentimes sufficiently de-risked that bigger investors can come in, and folks are more interested in investing at that point. In terms of the due diligence, we usually like to take the lead with that, and so we're looking at from all the typical perspectives within the business structure, the science behind what they're doing, and again, this is all within the structure of what I mentioned specifically before with Global Neuro Health Ventures of roughly 50% weighting on more traditional profitability, venture approach lens to evaluating the company. And then the other 50% is very specific criteria for potential impact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Chris, how about your organization? How do companies work with you once they're in the boat?
Well, I think there are multiple opportunities. We provide funding anywhere from discovery projects all the way up through phase 2 clinical trials. The dollar amounts are in the hundreds of thousands or tens of millions. We make investments that are have royalty bearing, and then in other instances, it's more of a proof of principle. And let's do 1 or 2 small studies and see if this technology is applicable to CF in the realm that we think it is. And if it is, and the company wants to keep working, then they can approach us for additional support. So I think that in terms of due diligence, we take an examination of definitely of the science, but also of the company itself. What is its present financial standing? What does the team that is seeking to advance the project, what are their experiences like? And if they're seeking to bring on additional people to apply to the program, in what areas do they hope to buttress their FTE count? So we try to examine all aspects of the opportunity that's presented to us, and we're seeking to be as good a partner as we can. We have a very large clinical trial network that has done probably 100 or more trials in CF over the past 20 years or so, and so we can bring to bear a lot of expertise in terms of clinical protocol development. And in the past couple of years, we have sought to acquire, I suppose is the right way to describe it, more of the community voice, the patient voice. What elements of this protocol are really feasible in terms of their daily life? Are some of these outcomes important to us? And we also have regular discussions with regulators as well to talk about what are emerging outcomes, how could they be applicable, and what needs to be done to advance these novel clinical measures. So we seek to be the best partner we can in trying to advance therapies for the benefit of CF patients.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for highlighting that. That was one aspect I thought would definitely come up here, is the both, I think, the very close interactions with patients that we have an opportunity to have. At LLS, for example, we have a clinical trial support center, we have a patient registry, and of course, we're sort of a community organization, if you will, from the bottom up. So that provides a different perspective and also opportunities to educate patients on novel therapies and create some understanding in this often really bewildering world of novel molecular medicines. So I think that's a really, really important piece, a regulatory piece, I think, that you mentioned, Chris, as well. For LLS, as an example, we're actually holding the IND on a large precision medicine study that gives us certainly the hands-on experience as well in terms of how to actually implement and what regulatory questions and issues may arise in the context of bringing some of these novel therapies to patients. So Kuldip, in terms of your organization, any particular facets you'd like to highlight for how companies work with you and how you try to really position them and help move them towards success?
As Michael said earlier, if we're going to fund companies and you get a grant from us, we want to make sure that we we help with their success. And so whether it's connecting them to resources, we understand ALS is a rare disease. Not everybody may have experience in it. And so connecting them to antibodies that they can use or animal models they should use, collaborating them or connecting them to academic investigators. Patient voice, I think, is important. If you have a trial, will help you get that out to the patient so that you don't have difficulty in recruitment and enrolling patients. We inform them, we educate them on what the program is, what the target is, what the drug is, and so on. One thing I would like to touch on is companies can also get involved in a pre-competitive fashion. One of the things that our organization does really well, and I know at Michael J. Fox this was the case, it doesn't always have to be grant funding. You may not need our grant funding, but you may want to know what the field is like. You may want to know who the players are. You may want to know who what's going on, and there are a lot of pre-competitive consortia within nonprofit organizations around tools, around biomarker development, around understanding payers and payee information for drugs when they get to the market, things like that, that companies can participate in and know more about the disease.
Yes, I think that is such an important aspect, and we definitely see that as well. Companies come really not at all because of the money, but what we're really interested in is a deep scientific understanding, the connections in the clinical world, and the understanding of the overall, the bigger picture, and how they can best position themselves. So I think this is something invaluable where I think as nonprofits we have a really good perspective to share. And I think our opinions are really being valued in a different way by companies. So. Paul, from the Crohn's and colitis perspective, what can companies expect working with you? What are you guys doing to smoothen the road for them?
Sure, yeah. I think your point about just the position that a lot of our foundations and organizations occupy in the larger disease area network is really important, because I think that is something that we try to do, is try to take advantage of our connections and our place in that network and really help our portfolio companies take advantage of that as well. So we do have a number of specific resources around that, and also informal resources as well, just sort of connections by word of mouth and that sort of thing. And many of those are available to the community at large to some degree, and we may have preferential access or reduced price access or something like that for our portfolio companies. But similar to, while others have mentioned, we have clinical trial awareness programs. We have opportunities to try and incorporate the patient voice. We do have some more formal programs, both. We have a conference certainly that tries to bring that community together and really promote partnering within it and promote networking within it. We also have programs that are designed to be a little more individualized, where we try to play sort of a matchmaker role between companies that we fund and also just early stage companies in the area, and the pharma companies that we do also have relatively extensive connections to. So we're definitely looking at all the different ways that we can try and expand those resources and both make them available specifically to the companies we fund as well as to the community at large. I think something that we do that may be a little bit different from some of the other foundations is that for the specific companies that we fund, the funding agreements we sign are essentially milestone-driven research contracts. And so once we identify a company that we're interested in funding, they have certainly already submitted a research plan that describes that project. But when we are working through what the contract is, we'll often work with them a bit to define that project plan and match it to our resources. For example, we recently set up a different way for a portfolio company to access our biobank at a reduced rate in sort of an accelerated fashion. So that's another resource I should mention. We do have an extensive biobank, as I'm sure many foundations do. And so we set up these milestones as a guide through the project, and also as milestones that tell us when to release different tranches of money. And so we do check in on progress against milestones. We have regular meetings where we hope to provide advice and additional help And we are flexible around milestones that may change as a project progresses. As we all know, that's certainly a possibility. But so that is something that may be a little bit different structurally in our investment versus others. And in general, the projects we fund are 1 year. And so that's really the year where we are checking in very regularly with our portfolio companies. But we do want those relationships to extend past the completion of the projects. And so even if we're not checking in quarterly anymore, we are still there as a resource and there as, hopefully a partner that can connect companies to other experts and perspectives in the larger organization and field.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for bringing up the biobanks as well. I think databases, those are efforts I think that organizations like ours are really, really driving to a large degree, and that are fantastic resources, I think, for researchers all over the world to tap into. At this point, I want to check in with Jessica and see whether we have some questions from our audience for the panel.
Yes, we got 2 questions from our live audience. The first question is from Sylvia Hauser, a question for Michael Cole. What is the average investment size, and would you invest as far as phase 1? The bridge to human trials seems to be very difficult with regard to funding.
Yeah, so our average, I should say, initial investment would be about 1 million, but there's pretty good bandwidth for that depending on the context, and we would go all the way up to phase 1 for initial investment. That would be a little bit more unusual, though. We try to stay a little bit earlier stage. And just to follow up on the other point too, in terms of the overall average that's put into a company, it could be as high as 10 million. A lot's left for the follow-on funding to help. I think what's being touched on is to get to the point that things are sufficiently de-risked that then some of the bigger investors could come in to help with the clinical trials.
Okay.
And
Jessica, there was a second question.
Yep, we got a second question from Bradley Everson. I've noticed a lot of the founders in this panel are nonprofit or fund more in the proof of concept stage and small amounts. However, in order to actually manifest a huge change and impact in medicine takes a large amount of capital down the line. For instance, to do a study to show superiority to a standard of care tied to outcomes takes at least tens of millions of dollars and many years to overhead. Does this panel know investors or organizations that can fund this kind of thing, especially for diagnostic?
Okay, anyone like to get started to answer that question? I think we're talking about registration enabling trials here, which of course can be a challenge depending on indication area.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, we're, our annual investment, research investment last year was $20 million. And that covered 70 projects. Yes, it is tough. I think, for nonprofits like ours that are at a smaller scale to fund anything larger than that. There are investors that will come in if they think this is an interesting project. As I said, that's the goal for us, is to provide the grantee with enough funding so that they can make this attractive for a larger investor. In the diagnostic space, it's been even more difficult, I think, and that's something we are trying to do. We've had a challenge where we have funded companies to develop assistive technology or some brain mapping interface where patients can communicate. But how do you get that commercialized? I think it's been a real rate limiting step, and I wish I had an answer for that, but I think it's something, it is a challenge in that.
Absolutely, yeah. Other thoughts from anyone else? I can certainly step in from my perspective. So for LLS, I can say I've noted we have actually contributed to funding registration enabling studies, and we will make investments potentially up to $10 million in in the context of a particular study or a particular company. That being said, of course, there's quite a high bar, and there needs to be a very, very convincing case in terms of the mission, in terms of also the business case to enable us and really give us comfort, the comfort level to jump in. I would absolutely second what you said, Koda, which is that what we can often do is we can attract other investors. And this is something at LLS we're really working to build further, as we've sort of been able to gain some real credibility in the professional investment world, sort of getting the stamp of approval from one of our organizations, knowing that we have a very thorough due diligence process at LLS. We will look at possibly a couple hundred companies over the course of the year, and we may fund 3, 4, 5 within a single year. We probably have about 20, 25 sort of in our pipeline at any point in time. I think that also just gives a lot of credibility, and then having a network also in the professional investor world, having partnerships with pharma companies. I think it helps, it gives you credibility, it helps really a network. So we may not be able to fund your study, but we may help you to get funding for your study.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, and I want to explicitly thank you all our panelists for participating today. It's been very insightful for myself as well, and encourage everyone to reach out to us with further questions, and we're hoping you'll enjoy the rest of the conference.